I give a fuck? Why do I give a fuck? Why do I try so hard? Why do I care so much?
Welcome to Why Do I Give a Fuck? A cross-cultural conversation between myself, Diane Tate,
and Johanna Thompson. In these times of great struggle and possible shift, we ask ourselves,
why do we give a fuck about any of it? How does the lens we see the world through impact what we see?
And what do we do about it? So let's talk some more about the surrounded and what does that look like as far as Amanda having these conversations, Amanda Seals having these conversations with folks that might have different perspectives and point of views on our political policies.
Yeah, it was interesting. I watched it this morning, and the format is really interesting. The organization that does it is called Jubilee, and that's their YouTube channel, and it's called Surrounded. And so the focal person that's picked to be in the center of the circle and doing the debating with the folks that are in circle around them is they identify as a specific, self-identified category, whatever that is. For Amanda Seals, it was a Black radical individual. That was her self-identity. And then the folks that were in circle around her identified as Black conservatives. So they surround them with people who would identify as something that could be considered opposite as the identification of the focal person. And so they have a timer on the table, and they do a 3-second countdown, and people get up and they run for the chair opposite Amanda, and whoever touches it first gets to sit down with her. And it's so interesting to me. And I'm a member of her Patreon community, and I messaged when I sent her a message about how well she did. I said it was so interesting to watch because you can see people that get up. There's certain individuals that get up multiple times.
Yeah.
But they don't move fast enough to get to the center circle. So it's like they want
Okay.
to be there, but
they're edging into the space. Like, do I really want to?
And I thought that was interesting. I was watching the body language. I was like, you aren't even trying to get in that center seat. You're just happy to be there or whatever. But
I love that. In community organizing spaces, there's a version of that that's called the fishbowl. And so if folks aren't familiar with that, or if you have an opportunity to experience it, it's a really good experience to help to get different perspectives from people and really speak into what your value proposition in the proposition is in the space.
Right. And the center person, the focal person, comes with 3 different debate precepts that they want to debate. And so you have topics that you're going to talk about, 3 different ones. And so you do, I don't know what the time frame is, but you do the first precept for a certain number of minutes, and then the second precept, and then the third. And so what was different about Miss Seal's time in the hot seat versus other folks that I've seen is that she was determined that people were not, she was setting really clear boundaries about whether or not they were going to be respectful, that they weren't going to interrupt her. Because I've watched others with other focal people in the middle, and the interrupting is just horrible, and you hardly ever get to really hear because they're stepping on each other's toes. And she really set a very clear precedent for that, and it was followed definitely. And then the other piece about it is you get each person that sits in the chair across from her, they get a certain amount of time, and I don't know exactly. I looked at the clock, but I'm not really remembering what the time was. Maybe 5 minutes to debate with her about whatever it is they want to counter on her precept. But the other people that are in the circle around her have flags, and as the person that's debating, the topic, the focal person in that moment, as they're presenting their argument, the people in the outer ring can start raising their flag if they don't think the person is making a clear argument, or if they think that Amanda or the focal person is just obliterating their stance, they start to raise their flags. And I don't know if it's all of the people in the outer circle, but a majority of them, once they all have their flags up, they will stop it no matter how much time they have left on the timer and say, you've been voted out. And that person has to get up and go back to the circle. And then they start the countdown again, and people rush for the chair again. So,
and how many people did Amanda Seals unseat? And I'm going to offer that she wasn't in the hot seat. I
Yeah,
was going
I
to offer
don't
that
know,
she
but
was in the hot seat. I was going to actually offer that she was on the throne and those who came that sat in front of
we're
the
in the hot
throne
seat.
were in the
Thank
hot
you.
seat.
Much better languaging.
Just to
Yes.
rephrase a little bit.
Yes, much better languaging. She was definitely on the throne, and they were in the
Yeah.
hot seat. I don't know exactly what the number is. I'd have to go back and watch, but what I do know is that I noticed how many of them got voted out before they even by the outer
Finished
circle,
the
before
time.
they even got done with their time. It seemed to happen more with her than with other surrounded episodes that I watched. So it was quite a few because she was just made for that format,
Mhm.
really. I mean,
Yeah.
I
And
wish
she knows her
I would be better.
stuff. She knows her stuff and she like sits in like,
That's so good stuff.
on she stands on her square
Yeah.
about where she feels. And not a lot of people come into spaces of debate with such a really strong rooted understanding about, what inequities look like and how to like shift them.
And she really understands, which I remember learning this myself, is that when you're debating, an actual debate is about
Yeah.
fact. It's not about opinions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think our national discourse in the US has gotten so sloppy because it's all about opinions. A lot of people don't have facts, or they're countering facts with opinions, which is not that's not the way a debate works.
Mm-hmm.
That's just an argument. So when people would come to her and she was spitting facts and they were spitting, she was like, no, 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 I'm sorry, but that's just not true. And she would counter.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some young folks there that really just, she was like, wow. At one point, she asked me, she said, are you acting? She's like, it
Mm-hmm.
feels like you're acting,
It's
because
real. Yeah.
he's coming at her with such bogus conservative talking points. It was horrible, and it was really interesting to watch. So I encourage folks to go and watch that episode, not only because I thought the premise itself was really interesting, not just the format, but she considers herself a black radical. There were several folks that wanted to call her a liberal, and she stopped them. She's like, no, 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 I'm not a liberal. I'm a radical. And so
Mm-hmm.
a couple of them asked her, like, well, what is that? What is your definition of radical? Because they
Yes.
understand better. And it's a fabulous episode.
Do
So
you remember, do you recall what the definition of radical versus somebody who is liberal in their understanding of policy? Or we could even talk about that.
yeah.
Like what would you consider somebody who's radical in their policies and somebody who's liberal and somebody who's conservative um, within
Well,
your community? Because I think you should speak from your community.
yeah, my community. So do we even have any radical people in my community? I don't know. What I have recently learned is
Hmm.
that the definition of radical is to be pulled up from the root, to extract from the root. That's actually the definition of radical. I didn't know that. I've always thought of radical based on what the societal norm had taught me, which was somebody who was, bucking the system and going against always going against the grain, and who wasn't afraid to step out of their box, and rules
Hmm.
be damned. And I mean, that's the mindset. That's the supposition definition that I had gotten from just greater society. When I heard that the definition was actually about being pulled up from the root, I was like,
Hmm.
well, I really like that, because that makes more sense to me. And so in regards to her self-identifying as a black radical, she talked a lot about systemic racism. She talked a lot about the systems and breaking the systems down that were oppressing black people in the US. And that, to me, is what I feel like helpful or useful radicalism should be. Is let's get to the root of it. When you and I were working for
Yeah.
for the organization that we met through before, I often have these conversations with people that were like, well, but they're feeding
You
people.
were definitely radical.
Well, I'm glad, I'm happy to hear that. That makes me happy. Because I was like, it's one thing to feed people, and that's very important. We need to feed people that are hungry, but why aren't we working to eradicate the systems that have
Cause the hunger.
people be in food insecurity in the first place?
Yes.
That's
Yes.
where
Yes.
I want to focus. I mean, it's a both and. It's not an either or. So we can do all things at once. But when it was a predominantly white organization. For those of you who haven't watched that episode where we talked about this, and it was all very love will find the way, and why can't we all just peace, 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 and but people would stop often. Their threshold to stop in their movement work was, well, but I'm feeding someone. Well, but I'm, helping here and I'm volunteering at this organization. And isn't that enough? And it's like, no, it's not enough because we're not
because
doing
it's going to continue within the system. Yeah. No,
so
that makes sense.
it's a radical. I'd love to hear.
I mean, I'm going to go along with this uprootedness and understanding. When I used to hear the designation of radical associated with something, I used to catch offense on the word. Like, why are you calling this person just because they don't fall within the status quo radical? Because there is such a negative connotation
Right,
with radical in the way that we speak within our social networks.
right.
And then I started to recognize that making that designation of radical does remove you from what is traditional. And so in this uprootedness,
Mm,
and if you are a person that really tries to live and to operate in what is considered the non-traditional from the
mm,
status quo,
mm.
then radical is a much better nomer. It's less of a misnomer than the way that I used to think about it.
I-
So I appreciated that. And I understand liberalism to be, as opposed to conservatism, liberalism to continue within the structures, but want to push a more progressive agenda within that. And so that doesn't move enough. That's just like that organization that we were talking about. I'm doing my thing, but I'm not really trying to uproot from
right,
what is traditional. And then conservative is just, going hard with what's traditional and not being able to see any visions of any type of things that are different
right.
or reimagining things in any other way.
Yeah.
And so if I was going to self-identify, I would self-identify as a radical as well. And that is because I am really committed to how do we exist in our structures, not in our structures, how do we create and imagine structures that are completely different from the ones that we exist in, because the ones that we exist in are so harmful to so many people. And
Right.
coming out of harming so many people is what I would hope for the future of human existence, not our country, but
Yeah.
human existence in its entirety. Yeah.
Yeah, she had an interesting when you said spoke about liberal and what liberal means. She spoke at one point, I don't remember if somebody was like, "So you don't identify as liberal, you don't think you are." She's like, "No," she said to her, again, I'm paraphrasing. She said that to her, liberal is really just I'm not a Republican. And and
I guess so.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, that was like, yeah, ding, 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 because I used to identify as a liberal, and then I kind of moved to a progressive, and then I'm not even sure. I mean, I guess radical would be the term that I probably would want to use because, I like progressive better than liberal, but I like radical better than progressive. So yeah, especially if it's about where are the systems, how are they ensconced, and how can we change them? And you asked me if there were, speaking from my community, if there are any radicals that I can think of, and quite honestly, I can't.
Mm,
Now, somebody else said, "Well, what about this person?" Then maybe I would go, "Oh yeah," but I'm just not even. I mean, even the people that are in that would identify as white, that's the community I'm identifying with. Even the people out there that are like marching in the streets or have marched in the streets in the past, like the Jane Fondas and the people that I mean, maybe Jane Fonda. I don't even know if Jane Fonda would be considered a radical. She was called a
mm,
radical back in the day during the Vietnam War when she was doing all of the things that she was doing to try to stop that war. But I don't see her really addressing or talking about the dismantling of systems or and maybe I'm not listening enough, but
mm,
that idea of I feel like I've seen more, especially in the white community. I've seen more people who are in that space of, well, I'm marching and I'm screaming and I'm doing these things, which I do as well, but they're not talking about doing more than that. They're not talking about,
mm.
let's get into the conversations of how do we dismantle, 400 years of systemic
Systemic
racism
oppression.
and
Yeah.
oppression. You know,
Hmm.
what do we, and so
Capitalism. How are we dismantling
yeah,
capital? And I'm just not as well read to name the folks, but like
yeah,
one of the organizations that I participate in, there are a number of people that might be identified as particularly white radical that were looking at systems differently, and they would be looked at differently. Like if we're looking at Marx or any of those folks, you know, going Lenin's and going back in the day, those were radicals, and their understanding
yeah,
about social systems with humans did look at things differently than the structures that we exist in
yeah.
today.
I guess I'm thinking in terms of like the US and like, do we have any,
Yeah, right now.
you know, a Gloria Steinem might be considered a person
Okay.
in that would have back in her day would have been seen
Hmm.
as radical, and I'm sure the R word was used for her to describe her back in that day, and
I
yet,
don't, Margaret Thatcher. I don't know. And then now it's interesting because we're naming more female identified humans than we are male identified humans that sit
right,
at the top of the hierarchical pole that might not really want
yeah.
to. Oh, okay. Well, hold
But
on.
even
Bernie
Gloria
Sanders
Steinem,
might be.
but even Gloria
Bernie Sanders
Steinem,
might be a little radical.
she was standing in the space for women's equality, but was she standing in the space? There's a lot of criticism
Hmm.
about the fact that Black women were not allowed in that club.
Yeah.
Black women were not the ones advocated for. And so, you know, to me, that's not a radical. If you're asking for change,
Hmm.
but you're asking for just enough change. You're not for you,
Hmm.
not
Yeah.
you're not thinking about who's not at the table, who's not in the conversation. And I know that
Well,
my
because then you're not meeting the definition according to the one that you shared earlier. You're
talking
not
about
really
the roots. Right,
uprooting like yourself
right,
from the
right,
space and from the what you exist under.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah, I can't think of any white man that would that would
that would qualify for radical. I'm curious if there's any white man who would want to qualify.
now one just came to mind. One just came to mind. Harvey Milk.
San Francisco,
Where
60s.
white man identified
Yeah,
as openly
was
gay.
it 60s? Was Harvey Milk during the 60s or was that more 70, early 80?
Might have been
I don't.
70s, early 80s, because
Okay,
it was early, yes, late 70s, early 80s. So yeah, he would be, I mean, and again, he's not a
radicals.
white man, but he belonged to and was a part of a marginalized community and was standing in space.
Hmm.
So there, you know, he's a name that comes to mind. I'm sure there are plenty of white men in the LGBTQIA community that we could say
Hmm.
in that space.
Regular name, yeah.
Yeah. So, but that's one of the rare, I want to say rare, I guess rare is a good term, rare incidences where white men intersect with a marginalized and oppressed group. You know, it doesn't,
Hmm.
gosh, I'm not even sure I can think of another. I mean, if we're thinking of LGBTQIA as enveloping anyone that would identify out of the binary when it comes to that. Can you think of another group where white men would also
I
intersect
know.
with?
That's what I'm saying. Like I don't. I'm not well read enough, other than like going like back to like European white males and people who adopt like Marxist ideologies and all that into their being and into the work that they're doing.
Yeah,
But those folks are probably existing in the United States not on a very large platform because they would be
right,
completely targeted
right.
by everything. So I just don't know, but I'm going to do some research and see if we can come back and have some discussions, or I'm inviting any of the folks that are listening to us to give us some knowledge about folks that you might identify as radical in their being. And then radical, we're talking about radical towards the policies and the values that we have. And then there's radicals that want things that would not be so good for me in my existence.
Right, right, right.
So
And you know, in our last
there's
episode,
a whole spectrum. Hmm.
right. In our last episode, we talked about the, you know, deployment of the National Guard in DC. And I was thinking about,
Yes.
you know, when we had the insurrection on January 6th and the National Guard was nowhere to be found,
Hmm.
and how juxtaposition that is between crime is bad now, and so now we're going to have 800 National Guardsmen when the statistics don't support that crime is rampant in DC. I mean, there's crime, but it's not worth
Yeah.
of a deployment of 800 armed troops on the city streets.
Mm.
So
Except to fill those, cop cities that they're building up and
yeah,
and making available
yeah,
um, for any type of enforcement. And that also just is making me think in the United States, school has restarted. And it
Mhm.
makes me think about like what it is that is going to be happening in the schools to kind of brainwash young people into the systems that we exist under as acceptable and as the way the US should be run. I'm always concerned about that because I had to and I chose to remove my second child from the educational system and teach at home. And so yeah, I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking as like educational content has changed and what young people are going to be learning about what civic engagement looks like, especially because all the laws and policies at this time are saying that people cannot, um, follow what we know as our Bill of Rights. You know what I mean? Our First, Second, and Third Amendment, and all of those things within democracy are being completely eroded in this moment. And like, what is the conversation in civics class? And I think about that because when I was in school, I was supporting with teaching civics, and
Yeah.
I can imagine what that conversation is going to look like in schools in this moment, especially in the southern region, particular.
Well, and I also want to add to that another caveat that I've heard of that I don't know all the states that are doing this, but the outlawing of phones. Children are not allowed to have phones anymore in the schools.
Hmm.
And there's two reasons why I think that is messed up. And it's
Hmm.
funny as I hear myself say
Jail.
because, well, um,
Jail.
it, it's funny because as I think about that, I remember back in the day when my young person was young and phones were a thing and kids were starting to carry phones and they weren't the smartphones yet, but they were at least phones and I resisted it. I was like, she doesn't need a phone. She doesn't need a phone. And but now, it's like you're going to outlaw for two major reasons that I've thought of. And if anybody listening has other thoughts, I'm sure you'll come up with some too. The first thing is they need those phones to be able to call for help if somebody comes in and tries to shoot up the school. So it's like
Talk about
I don't
it.
want
Talk
my
about
child.
it.
I don't want my child. That's schools are war zones anymore because they are vulnerable.
Jails.
Yeah. So they need their phones so that they can call for help because the schools are not keeping them safe and they're not, and they need to have their phones. But then also too, they need to be able to have access to information, right? And so to your point, here we are, we're changing what's in the books, we're changing which books are allowed in, we're changing what the teachers can teach, we're changing what the dialogue can talk about, and we're taking away the small computers that the students
Hmm.
have to Google to find out if what they're being taught is wrong. Um,
Yeah.
So yeah, it's another piece of completion when it comes to surrounding kids in places that create an opportunity for them to be easily brainwashed and propagandized
Yeah.
into what the dominant culture wants them to know or not know.
Yeah, it's very, very scary. And I'm always concerned about young people that are in school that don't have a support system of caregivers that can help them to expand what they're learning in school, and or people who are like, no, whatever you're taught in school is the thing, is the right thing. And so then for a young person who's trying to develop an understanding about the world that they're existing in, it could cause like a lot of confusion, frustration, and dislike of being in that environment.
Yeah.
Besides the fact that schools and the limiting of student autonomy is really very, very dangerous to me. I'm in Florida, so school phones in schools have been outlawed. Again, I've experienced a lot of the stuff that y'all are all just starting to experience because I live in Florida.
In Florida.
And so young people couldn't have phones in schools. They would be confiscated or they would get in trouble if the phones were pulled out. And I don't understand why educational system is not incorporating technology because that is actually what young people are going to need to be able to have a command of understanding and use of in a healthy way to be able to actually exist in their lives as adults and trying to, sustain their lives. But yeah, as far as the schooling and the indoctrination that happens and the way that the school system is run, the reason why I removed my child, one, because of the harm of like the content of information. I didn't want her to be learning that she herself was somebody that she shouldn't like or respect. And that's
Right.
what most of the stuff in the school was feeding into her. And then the way that they do the bells are just like the prisons, the way that they only have 30 minutes to eat lunch these days, their recesses are cut out. Like the things that are happening in the US school system, they're in schools for a longer period of time during the year. Like summers have been reduced so that our systems are holding their minds captive
Mm.
and are not allowing them to, like the freedom of expression and thought. And educating is like, as I understand the definition of it, is to bring forth knowledge that's already existing inside of ourselves and just to kind of enhance our ability and skill with that. But the way that our United States school systems are going, and people kind of praise them as being really cutting edge. And if we're looking at a world statistic, our young people coming out of schools are only indoctrinated into US policy and understanding. And that's just a really scary thing to be thinking about. I'm not anti education, but I'm like pro education that is actually going to allow people to explore
Yeah.
and expand their knowledge and not that limits and restricts their knowledge in the way that the US educational system is doing now.
Yeah.
So it's something for all of our listeners to be thinking about, especially if you have your young people. And US education is a real opportunity for caregivers at home to ask their young people what it is that they learned in school today, and then pull out those phones or those computers and check in what the other understanding and perspectives of that knowledge are, so that young people really can have the tools that they need to be thinking people.
Yeah. And teach them to question. You know,
Mhm.
I remember very clearly when you said that the education systems were that schools were that everything you learn in school it must be true, right? And
Mhm.
I remember believing that, you know, that well they taught us in school, so it must be true. I
Not true.
no, not at all. And more so and more so, I mean, it was manipulated after the Civil War for, you know, decades and decades. So still is, but so the education that I got was not accurate. And
Yeah.
I'm slowly unpacking that and learning what the real stories were and are. But it feels like it feels like the intention that was behind the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, that changed the textbooks after the Civil War so that slavery was glorified instead of vilified. Those that intention and that practice feels elevated. It feels like it's constricted even more
Come on.
because it's
Yeah, they're
not
taking away student rights. That's
right.
another one of the Bill of Rights. I mean, like they're taking away all of that, all of the things that hold our democracy is completely being eroded in this new administration to
Yeah,
create the United States that existed at the founding of this
right.
country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, it leaves you like speechless. It really does.
yeah, it's like okay, I don't know what
Hmm.
else to I don't know what else to say after that. Yeah, it's I, I I am nervous about AI. I'm nervous about, you know, I'm reading about the destruction to the surrounding communities, to these information centers that AI is being run by. I don't know if you've heard about that. We
What do
can
you mean? No, I don't know what you're saying.
where where there are centers, the AI has to be, you know, there has to be a central computer base
Computer hubs.
to run
Hmm.
the AI. And so these central bases are these massive box spaces where, and they use an enormous amount of water. So anytime anybody Googles anything for chat GPT, for example, the amount of water that these bases are sucking out of the environment, the
Oh
surface landscape.
no, that's horrible.
Oh, it's
Oh
it
no,
is,
not
yeah,
to our environment.
it's
That's
really
horrible.
it's really destructive. And I saw a video just a few days ago of an interview with a family that live in a neighboring town to one of these centers. I don't
Hmm.
remember what state it was in. I'll try to find the video and share it with you. And the woman was talking about, you know, they can't get water. The water that's coming out of their faucet is just a trickle because the pressure, the water pressure, all of it's stolen to go towards this
These
AI
machines.
center to cool
Wow.
down the machines. And
Hmm.
so
So they must be some type of hydro processors.
Yeah,
help
they use
generate.
water to cool down the
Mm,
machines because the machines are running all the time because people are
hmm.
cooling all the time and they're using AI all the time. So this is the side effect of having it doesn't just happen, you know, in a vacuum. And
Yeah.
so yeah, it's so hard because some of the things that you feel like can be at least even partial solutions to help combat the constricture of free thinking and free thought. Like we've talked about AI, the use of AI and what it could be used for good is just as destructive
Harming the environment.
on
Yeah, man.
the environment in horrible ways. So
Just reminds us that like we exist in an ecosystem of connection. And that's really what I want to call us into, thinking about these conversations that we have. One thing is going to be a ripple effect to something else. And if we can start to remember that we are all connected in some way for the things that we're doing each and every day, we're all connected to it in some way. And
yeah.
we have to start being responsible and accountable to that with each other so that we can exist for as long as we want to.
Why do I give a fuck? Why do
Thanks for
I
joining
give a
us.
fuck?
Until next time,
Why
as you
do I
move
try
throughout
so
your day,
hard?
continue to ask yourself,
Why do I give a
Why Do I Give a Fuck is produced in collaboration with Johanna and Diane. Music by Norwegian musician Water. See you next time.